Hello again and welcome back to the Azure 101 video series. In today's session we're going to be looking at the migration, or what some would refer to as the adoption phase of the Cloud Adoption Framework. Now the good news for you here is that a lot of the hard work has been done by you already in other phases. So then this section is simply carrying out what you've already been detailing. And if you've just joined us at this video, it may be worth you stopping now and going back to the first one just so you can see and make sure it makes sense. So Gina, how do we start to understand the migration phase?
Thanks Sam, and hello again everyone. Nice to see you here. In our last session we learned that a landing zone is deployed before migration to form the foundation, and the best approach is an enterprise landing zone where the platform zones have individual subscriptions and shared resources, and application zones have their independent zones configured from the start. However, you can't simply hit a big go button and wait for the magic to happen. It doesn't quite work that way. No, so instead you're going to be working through a checklist before using a specific replication service to migrate the primary binaries. And by the way, primary binaries are things like operating systems, files and security protocols that are already on your servers and that you know that they definitely need to be in Azure. So what comes first then? Replication of the primary binaries and data transfer or infrastructure setup?
Well, the answer to this one, Gina, is it's a little bit of both actually. So we'll run through the start of it now together. In the last session, we saw that actually the organization would need to know and actually deploy first the landing zone that they will be using for their workloads. Remember, the enterprise landing zone here is the desired goal, so we're going to be assuming that approach when we talk about this. However, you can't deploy the application zone until you have those application resources, which is what you're actually going to be migrating with those primary binaries on the server. Therefore, you would actually need to start by setting up the infrastructure for the platform zones, such as management services, security services like Defender for Cloud, for example, maybe even Azure Firewall or patching services or monitoring resources, and so on and so on. You could also apply the policies, roles, templates that they actually need as well, which is where we covered this off in the last video. But are there any supporting services that you need to consider here as well?
Absolutely there are, Sam. You'll firstly need to fully set up your virtual network so traffic can move amongst your estate. This involves setting up network security groups, or NSGs, to define inbound and outbound traffic rules for your virtual networks. So these NSGs should be in place before migrating virtual machines or data to allow or deny traffic based on those rules. We don't want any malicious attackers compromising your workloads easily, or at all. Also, if you need to communicate between VNets or with a hybrid on-premise environment, you'll need to peer these virtual networks using a peering connection or a virtual wireless area network, or a VWAN. It's a really important step to validate you have fully set up these NSGs properly and the peering connections, since this is an area that can often get forgotten about or missed. Like an RDP port being allowed to a VM in a production, for example. But what else do these organisations need to be thinking about, Sam?
Well, now you've discussed VNets, Gina, we can actually start to think about other resources as well then, like load balancers. So these can actually be maybe internal or external load balancers used to actually distribute that traffic efficiently amongst the servers once they're actually being migrated to Azure. So you can create these resources in anticipation of the servers being migrated. However, you would need to then connect these load balancers to the VM by allocating the IP address to each of the load balancers backend pools. Also, there's not always a need to actually reinvent the wheel if you're actually moving from an on-premise to maybe an Azure mindset. You could use Microsoft Entra Connect. And actually what this would do is it would allow you to synchronize your on-premise identities to Entra so that you have cloud identities to work with straight away. Now this means that you could set up maybe the use of identity services such as Microsoft Entra Business to Customer tenants, which can then hold your customer user identity objects. And this is a great way to allow your customers using your SaaS applications or software as a service to authorize and authenticate themselves. Now just staying with the identities mindset for just a second, you may also need to deploy services like Key Vault, for example, to hold your keys, certificates and secrets. Now this is a really important recommendation, since it's best practice that Microsoft suggests to not have your keys or secrets published in your code, as it can lead to a security breach. So to mitigate this, you can set up services like Key Vault to hold those keys and secrets so your application can then go off and request them securely when they're actually needed. It's only once these platform zones have been then deployed that you are able to then readily migrate your estate. So based on that, can we actually then migrate yet, Gina?
Yes, Sam, it's finally time. At this stage, you would migrate your primary binaries, for example, your servers with their operating systems and files, as well as data, etc. So to do this, you can use great tools such as Azure Migrate. Alternatively, if you're already using Azure Site Recovery to protect your on-premise virtual machines, you could use this service as a migration tool beforehand as well. So this would happen by you installing the Azure Site Recovery agent, and that would be installed onto the servers you're protecting, and it would take snapshots of that server. You would have a policy set up to create the virtual machines and disks that will be needed in Azure. So you could simply run a failover and hey presto, your resources are automatically created for you, and the servers and your applications and data are ready to go. So you would then reconfigure Azure Site Recovery to protect your virtual machines that were created in Azure.
Yeah, that's a great consideration, Gina, so that actually an organisation can use something that they've already deployed and put it to another use. It is also worth noting though at this stage is that Azure Migrate will make right size recommendations as well as modernisation recommendations, but Azure Site Recovery will not. So businesses, if they are using that approach, will need to understand what resources are going to be deployed and actually have them configured and make sure they're right sized. So as we draw to a close then, you can use Azure Site Recovery to migrate your services. You can also use Azure Migrate, whichever one works for best for you. Azure Migrate, which is ultimately an umbrella for a collection of tools and resources that will include things like Azure Data Migration Service or the Data Migration Assistant or the Web App Migration Assistant. But these services combine to assess and then right-size the infrastructure that you have and then actually help to actually move them to Azure, whether they be in a third-party data center like AWS or on-premise. Now the tool itself is free to use for the first 180 days. However, after that, there will be charges to use the service. So you might want to consider that when you're adopting. There may also be some other charges for other resources that are needed, such as log analytics for visualizations on the dependencies that you've got, or maybe a storage account to hold this data. However, these are really minimal and actually it makes the process for migration a whole lot easier for your workloads to make it not only quick, but also easy and safe. So let's now have a look at some of the data services that you can use for migrating your data to Azure, such as Azure Databox or maybe Azure Import Export Service.
Great. So Azure Databox services allows an organization to load their data onto Microsoft provided disks. These are transported by courier and then arrive at your chosen Azure data center and uploaded. So the second service you can consider is the Azure Import and Export service. So this is similar to Azure Databox, however you can provide your own data disks should you choose, or still use the hard disk drive or solid state disk drives supplied by Microsoft. So each of these services allow you to use between 1 and 5 encrypted disks that you can store up to 8 terabytes of data on each, so that's 40 terabytes in total. And that should be more than enough for most businesses to get their data into Azure.
Yeah, thanks Gina. So the nice thing here with both of these services is that the uploads are being done for you by Microsoft, so you don't actually have to worry about things like bandwidth when transferring the data to Azure. So once your application resources are migrated, you can actually then start to set up the application zone, which again will be one application zone for each of your individual workloads, as we covered before. Now this is where you configure the more granular resources like Defender for Servers, for example, or even Azure Monitor, Application Insights, or even Key Vault, or Azure Backup, or even Azure Site Recovery for your disaster recovery purposes. Now these can only be set up once you actually have your data and your servers migrated across to Azure.
So there you have it for the last in this next installment of the Azure 101 series. So we have started to explore the cloud adoption framework, showcasing the strategy and plan phases to readiness and adoption phases. There really is so much content and considerations out there that each individual business can take. and we just couldn't cover absolutely everything. So I would encourage you that if you are adopting Azure for the first time, and maybe you are already on Azure but looking to add workloads and want to sanity check it, that you'd be doing it the best way possible, and please reach out. So both Sam and I are happy to support, and we have an army of engineers and experts that can support your cloud adoption journey as well. So you're never alone.
Yeah, that's right, Gina. And we are going to be adding other videos as well to contextualize elements of this, that you saw in this installment. So please do subscribe to the YouTube channel so that you can actually be made aware of this as soon as it's released.
Thanks, Sam. So for now, it's goodbye from me and goodbye from Sam.